Welcome to the deep dive. All right, so you know the drill. You send us your sources, like the really interesting articles and notes that have got you thinking, and we go in deep. We pull out the key ideas, the connections, the things that maybe you wouldn't have caught on a first read. It's like a fast track to getting a handle on some pretty complex topics with hopefully a few aha moments along the way.
Yeah, and the stuff you sent this time is, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but it all seems to revolve around some pretty big themes. We're talking global challenges, the big issues facing humanity, and then there's this whole question of individual purpose, like what are we all doing here, and how does money fit into that? And then there's this fascinating exploration of some very different economic systems, some really outside-the-box thinking.
Right, like we've got discussions of vector geld, this whole Minuto time voucher system, and even the concept of global citizenship's kind of all over the map, but in a good way.
Exactly. And your notes mention some pretty fundamental existential questions, too, like what really makes us happy and what values should guide our financial decisions. It's getting pretty deep in here.
It is. So what we're going to try to do today is weave all these threads together. We'll start with those big global challenges, then explore what it even means to be a global citizen in that context. And then we'll get really personal and think about how our individual search for meaning and happiness relates to, money.
Money, the root of all evil. Or maybe not. We'll see.
We'll see. And then we'll dive headfirst into those cutting-edge economic concepts. Vector geld and its potential to make the world a better place, right? Alongside real-world examples like that Minuto system. And get this, even individual blockchains for people creating their own currency.
That's a new one for me.
Yeah, me too. And we're going to unpack this whole idea of transaction fees acting like a kind of consent mechanism or even a funding tool. There's this very cool visual concept of vector Warren price, which uses angles to represent value, plus the notion that only the productive, whatever that means, should be creating currency.
We'll have to define that one.
We will. Yeah. Oh, and paying with virtual elements like in-game currency or NFTs. And of course, we need to make sure we really understand the difference between vector geld and vector Warren price.
Yeah, that one's important.
Plus, we'll touch on what internalization even means in economics. And whether a German citizen and, say, a Uruguayan citizen might view all of this differently. And we can't forget about the Global Citizenship Foundation and the work they do. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. Ready to dive in?
I'm ready. Let's start with the big picture, those global challenges.
The big ones. In your notes, you actually asked, what is the single most important issue facing humanity today? That's a huge question, right?
Yeah.
But your sources keep circling back to a few key areas that, we can't ignore.
And they all seem kind of intertwined, don't they?
Totally. So we're talking climate change, the urgent need for sustainability across the board, and then there's global justice, right?
Well,
making sure everyone has a fair shot. And then there's the whole artificial intelligence thing, which is, both exciting and a little bit scary. And of course, global health, which, after the last few years.
Yeah, that one hit home for everyone.
It did.
Yeah.
So how do we even begin to address these massive issues? Your sources seem to suggest that the only way forward is, together. Global cooperation.
Right, like it's not something any one country or group can solve on their own. It has to be a collective effort.
Absolutely. And your sources even outline some key principles and approaches for making that kind of collaboration actually work. Like, what are the building blocks of a truly cooperative global effort?
Well, first and foremost, you need genuine global cooperation, like nations and individuals working together across borders, sharing knowledge, resources, and, maybe even some of that power. And then there's sustainable development, making sure that whatever progress we make today doesn't screw things up for future generations.
Right. Thinking long term.
Exactly. Then there's justice and equality, which are kind of like foundational, right? You can't have a stable and peaceful world if huge chunks of the population are being left behind. And then there's innovation and technology, which are like the tools we need to actually solve some of these problems. But of course, tools can be used for good or for bad.
True. So we need to be careful with those tools.
Definitely. Then there's education and awareness, which are crucial for getting everyone on the same page and understanding the challenges and potential solutions. And then, of course, you need responsible leadership at every level, from local communities all the way up to global institutions.
Right. Leaders who can actually make the tough decisions.
Yeah, and who aren't just in it for themselves. And then there's the role of civil society organizations, those NGOs and grassroots movements that are often on the front lines, driving change from the bottom up.
The people power.
Exactly. And finally, and this is a big one, individual action. The choices each of us makes in our daily lives, they add up. They really do.
Like that butterfly effect, right?
Yeah.
Small actions can have big consequences.
Totally. So yeah, the problems are global, but the solutions, they involve everyone.
Now, speaking of everyone, let's talk about this idea of global citizenship.
Yeah.
You mentioned that earlier. How does that concept fit into all of this?
Well, global citizenship is, it's about expanding our sense of identity and responsibility, like moving beyond just thinking of ourselves as citizens of a particular country and recognizing that we're all interconnected, we're all sharing this planet, and we're all facing these same global challenges.
So it's about thinking of ourselves as citizens of the world.
Exactly. It's like we're all in this together. And your sources highlight some key aspects of what it actually means to be a global citizen. First, there's this awareness of global interconnectedness, like understanding how events and actions in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the globe.
Like how a virus in one country can quickly become a pandemic.
Right, exactly. And then there's this sense of responsibility toward those global challenges, right? Not just seeing them as someone else's problem. It's like, okay, this is our shared problem and we all have a role to play in finding solutions.
Ownership.
Yeah. And then there's this super important element of respecting diversity, valuing different cultures and perspectives, even if they're very different from our own.
Because, let's face it, the world is a pretty diverse place.
It is. And then there's active engagement. Like, it's not enough to just be aware and understand the issues. Global citizens actually take action, they get involved, they try to make a difference.
Put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, there's education for global citizenship, which is all about giving people the knowledge, skills, and values they need to be, well, effective global citizens. It's about equipping people to navigate this increasingly interconnected world.
It sounds like it's about being informed, engaged, and open-minded.
Totally. And there are actually a bunch of organizations out there that are really championing this whole global citizenship thing.
Oh, yeah. Like who?
Well, there are UN agencies like UNESCO and UNICEF, which are doing a lot to integrate global citizenship into their work on education and child welfare. And then there are NGOs like Amnesty International, which are working on human rights issues globally.
Making sure everyone's rights are being respected, no matter where they live.
Exactly. And then there's the Global Citizenship Foundation, which is specifically focused on promoting global citizenship education.
I've heard of them. Tell me more about what they do.
So they work directly with educational institutions, organizations, and young people in over 70 countries. Wow, that's a lot of countries. And they're all about building capacity, like helping individuals and organizations develop the skills and knowledge they need to be effective global citizens. They also do a lot of advocacy and engagement work, really pushing to make global citizenship education more widespread.
So they're out there spreading the word.
They are. And it's important to distinguish them from Global Citizen, which is a different organization that's focused primarily on tackling extreme poverty, similar names, but different missions.
Got it. So we've talked about the big global picture and how we're all kind of in this together. But now let's zoom in a bit and get, personal. Those existential questions you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the big ones, like what's the meaning of life? What really brings us happiness and fulfillment, and how does money, that thing we all seem to chase after, how does that fit into all of this?
Right, because your notes make this really interesting connection between these deep personal questions and, our relationship with money. It's not something we often think about explicitly, but it's definitely there.
It is. And your sources kind of present this dichotomy. Is money just a tool to achieve something else, or is it the goal itself?
Yeah, is it a means to an end or the end in itself?
Exactly. And that's a big question, right? Because on the one hand, money can definitely help us achieve things that we find meaningful. Like, it can give us the freedom to travel, pursue our passions, support causes we care about, or even just have more time to spend with loved ones.
It can open doors, right?
It can. But your sources also raise this really crucial question. What if the pursuit of money becomes the main thing? What if it overshadows everything else?
Like, what if we end up chasing money at the expense of everything else that actually matters?
Yeah, it's like we can get so caught up in making more money that we forget why we were even trying to make more money in the first place.
That's a trap, isn't it?
It can be. And then there's this whole question of happiness and fulfillment. Like, does having more money actually make us happier? We're often told that it does, but is it really that simple?
I've always wondered about that.
Me too. And your sources suggest it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, yeah, money can definitely reduce stress and increase our sense of security, especially if we're struggling to meet our basic needs.
Like you need enough to put food on the table and a roof over your head.
Exactly. But the research suggests that beyond that, beyond having enough to cover the basics, more money doesn't necessarily translate into more happiness.
I think that there's a tipping point, right?
Yeah, like a point of diminishing returns. And in fact, constantly chasing after more wealth can sometimes make us less happy.
How so?
Well, because it can distract us from the things that actually bring us joy and fulfillment, like spending time with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, connecting with nature, or just, having fun.
It's like we get so caught up in the rat race that we forget to actually live.
Right. And your sources also bring up this really interesting point about how we can use money to contribute to society.
Like philanthropy, donating to charities, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and even just choosing to spend our money in ways that support businesses and organizations that are doing good in the world.
Voting with your wallet.
Exactly. But the sources also ask this thought-provoking question. Can a relentless focus on profit, like always trying to maximize our financial gain, can that actually detract from our sense of meaning and purpose?
That's a tough one.
It is. It's like, if we're always focused on the bottom line, are we missing out on the bigger picture? Are we losing sight of the impact our work has on others and the world around us?
I guess it depends on what we're actually doing, right?
It does. And it also depends on our individual values. Like, what do we prioritize? What do we consider to be truly valuable?
Right, because the sources make this point that our financial choices, how we earn, spend, and invest our money, it all reflects our values.
It does. It's like our money is an extension of ourselves, and how we use it says a lot about who we are and what we believe in.
It's like a form of self-expression almost.
It is. And your sources also touch on this idea of financial independence and freedom, like how having enough money can give us the autonomy to pursue our passions and live life on our own terms.
Yeah, that's a big one for a lot of people.
It is. It's about having the resources to do what you want when you want without having to answer to anyone else. But there's also this flip side, right? The fear of financial insecurity.
Oh yeah, that's a big one too.
It is. The fear of not having enough, of losing what we've built, of not being able to provide for ourselves or our families.
It's a powerful motivator, that's for sure.
It is.
Yeah.
And then there's this really profound connection that your sources make between money and our own mortality.
Wow, yeah. That's not something we often talk about, but it's definitely there.
It is. And it's like thinking about our own mortality forces us to think about what we want to leave behind, right? What kind of impact we want to have on the world. And money, well, it inevitably becomes part of that equation.
Like, what will we do with our money while we're alive? And what will happen to it after we're gone?
Exactly. It's about legacy. It's about the mark we leave on the world, and that can be through inheritance, philanthropy, or even just the values we embody in our financial dealings.
It's about leaving the world a little bit better than we found it.
I like that. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about those really interesting economic concepts you mentioned earlier. Vector Geld and vector Warren Price.
Yeah, this stuff is pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and it's all about rethinking how we value things. Like moving beyond just monetary value and considering the broader impact of our economic choices.
Okay, break it down for me. What's the difference between vector Geld and vector Warren Price?
So vector Geld is the actual currency. It's the medium of exchange, like dollars or euros, but with a twist. It's designed to represent value across multiple dimensions, not just the monetary one.
So it's more than just money.
Yeah, it's like money with a conscience. And vector Warren Price, that's the value of a specific good or service expressed in vector Geld. But it's not just about how much it costs in terms of money. It also takes into account the ecological and social impacts of that product or service.
So it's like a price tag that tells you not only the financial cost, but also the environmental and social cost.
Exactly. And your sources even propose a formula for calculating this vector Warren Price. It's like the monetary value plus the ecological value plus the social value, all added together.
So a product that's produced sustainably and ethically would have a lower vector Warren Price than a product that's, say, made in a sweatshop and pollutes the environment.
Right. It's all about making the invisible costs visible.
That's a really interesting concept. So what are the benefits of making this distinction so explicit?
Well, for starters, it increases transparency. Consumers can clearly see the true cost of what they're buying, not just the price tag.
Informed decision-making.
Exactly. And it creates incentives for sustainability. Like, if people can see that a more eco-friendly product actually has a lower overall cost, they might be more likely to choose it.
It makes sense economically.
It does. And it can also promote social justice by incorporating the social cost of production into the price.
So products made in fair labor conditions would be more competitive.
Right. And ultimately, it empowers consumers to make more informed and ethical choices.
I like that. And there's something in your sources about visualizing the vector Warren price using angles. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. So imagine the vector Warren price as a line, a vector, and the angle of that vector relative to a horizontal line represents the overall ecological and social impact.
So like a steep angle means a big negative impact, and a shallow angle means a small impact or even a positive impact.
Exactly. And your sources suggest that this could be displayed digitally, like using augmented reality or something, so you could scan a product with your phone and see its vector Warren price angle right there on the screen.
That would be really cool.
It would. It would make it so much easier to compare products and make informed choices.
Now let's talk about transactions and fees within this vector geld system. How does that all work?
So a transaction in vector geld happens when a buyer and seller agree on a price, the vector Warren price. And this transaction itself creates what's called the transaction vector, which is basically a record of the exchange.
Right.
And the angle of this transaction vector, it can represent transaction fees or taxes.
So just like the vector Warren price, the angle tells you something about the cost.
Exactly. A small angle, close to zero, means low or no fees.
Like maybe for transactions within a local community or for essential goods and services.
Right. And a larger angle means higher fees or taxes, maybe for things with a big environmental impact.
So it's a way to incentivize certain types of behavior?
It is. And the cool thing is that these angles, and therefore the fees, can be adjusted dynamically based on all sorts of factors.
Like what?
Like the type of transaction, the time of day, even the ecological footprint of the product being bought or sold.
So it's a very flexible system.
It is. And your sources emphasize that transparency is crucial here. People need to understand how these fees are being calculated and where the money is going.
Makes sense. Now, you also mentioned this Minuto time voucher system.
Mm-hmm.
What is that exactly, and how does it fit into this whole vector geld framework?
So the Minuto system is a real-world example of a local complementary currency. And instead of being based on, traditional money, it's based on time.
Like 1 minuto equals 1 hour of someone's time.
Exactly. And your sources explore how the vector geld system could incorporate these kinds of local currency.
Okay, so how would that work?
So imagine someone offering a service within the Minuto system, like maybe a plumber fixes a leaky faucet and charges 3 minutos for their time. And then the person paying for the service, they pay in minutos, but there's also a small transaction fee that's paid in euros.
So it's like a bridge between the local time-based currency and a more widely accepted currency.
Exactly. And that euro fee, that's represented by the angle of the transaction vector within the vector geld system.
So you can still see the cost of the transaction, even though it's partially paid in a different currency.
Right. And the cool thing is that those euro fees, they can be used to support the Minuto system itself.
Like to fund the platform, develop new features, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or even to support local community projects.
So it's like a way to sustain the local economy.
It is. Now, let's get really crazy and talk about individual blockchains.
This one really blew my mind.
It's a pretty wild concept. The idea is that every single person who creates vector geld, they get their own personal blockchain.
So instead of one giant blockchain for everyone has their own little blockchain.
Exactly. And that blockchain, it keeps track of two things. First, when and how much vector geld they created.
So it's a record of their contribution to the currency supply.
Right. And second, it records the transactions they make using that specific vector geld that they created.
So it's not tracking every transaction they make, just the ones involving their own money.
Exactly. And the benefits here are pretty huge. First, it creates this incredible level of accountability. Like, you can see exactly who created how much vector geld and how they used it.
Transparency.
Total transparency. And it also potentially increases privacy because not all of your transactions are publicly visible on a single blockchain.
So it's like a balance between transparency and privacy.
Exactly. And it also gives people more control over their own financial data.
Now, another fascinating concept in your sources is this link between the intent behind vector geld creation and the euro transaction fee. Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, so this is all about aligning our values with our financial transactions. Like, when someone creates vector geld, they can imbue it with a certain direction or intention.
So they can say, this vector geld is intended to support renewable energy, or this vector geld is intended to promote social justice.
Exactly. And then when someone chooses to use that vector geld to buy something, they're kind of implicitly agreeing with that intention.
They're saying, I support that goal, and I'm willing to pay a small fee to contribute to it.
Right. And that fee, that goes back to the creator of the vector geld, who can then use it to further their intended purpose.
So it's like a way to direct funding to specific causes or projects.
It is. And it makes the whole economic system more values-driven.
Now, another term that came up in your sources is the productive, creating currency. Who are the productive, and how would they go about creating vector geld?
So the productive are basically anyone who creates value in society. That could be producers of goods, providers of services, artists, musicians, writers, you name it.
So it's a pretty broad definition.
It is. And the idea is that these productive individuals and entities, they should be the ones creating the currency, rather than just banks or governments.
Okay, but how would that actually work?
Well, there are a few potential mechanisms. One is direct creation, where someone creates vector geld when they provide a good or service.
So like a farmer creates vector geld when they sell their produce.
Yeah, or a musician creates vector geld when they perform a concert. And then there's indirect creation, where someone receives vector geld as payment for their work and can then use it to buy things or invest in other productive activities.
Okay.
And then there's platform-based creation, where a digital platform facilitates the creation of vector geld by people who are offering their products or services through that platform.
So there are a lot of different ways to do it.
There are. And the key here is to make sure that currency creation is tied to the creation of real-world value to prevent inflation and ensure that the system remains stable.
That makes sense. Now let's talk about paying with virtual elements. What's that all about?
So your sources explore this really interesting idea of using things like in-game currencies, NFTs, loyalty points, even digital services as a form of vector geld for transactions in the real world.
So like I could use my World of Warcraft gold to buy groceries.
Well, maybe not World of Warcraft gold specifically, but the general idea is that these virtual elements, which people already value and trade, could become part of the broader economic system.
And the transaction fee would still be paid in euros.
Right. So it's like a way to bridge the gap between the virtual world and the real world.
That's pretty futuristic.
It is. And it could open up all sorts of new possibilities for commerce and exchange.
Now, earlier you mentioned how different global perspectives might influence how people view these connections between money and existential questions. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so your sources suggest that someone in Germany, for example, might have a very different perspective on these things than someone in Uruguay.
Because of their different cultural backgrounds and economic realities.
Exactly. Like, when it comes to the meaning of life, a German citizen might place more emphasis on individual achievement and self-realization, while an Uruguayan citizen might prioritize family and community well-being.
Different values, different priorities.
Right. And this can extend to how they view happiness and fulfillment. Like, a German citizen might associate happiness with material wealth and professional success, while an Uruguayan citizen might find happiness in strong social connections and a sense of belonging.
It's all relative, isn't it?
It is. And these differences can also influence their financial decisions. Like, a German citizen might be more focused on long-term financial planning and security, while an Uruguayan citizen might be more present-oriented and prioritize immediate needs and experiences.
It's all about context.
It is, and it highlights how money isn't just this neutral tool. It's deeply intertwined with our cultural values and personal beliefs.
Finally, we're going to touch on this economic concept of internalization. What does that mean exactly, and how does it relate to everything we've been discussing?
So internalization is all about making sure that the true cost of something, including its environmental and social impacts, is reflected in the price.
So it's about accounting for those hidden costs that are often borne by society as a whole.
Exactly. Like, if a company pollutes the environment, those costs should be factored into the price of their products, not just passed on to the community.
Makes sense.
And mechanisms like carbon taxes or the ecological and social vectors in the vector warm price, those are examples of ways to internalize those external costs.
So it's about making sure that the price we pay for things reflects the true cost to society and the planet.
Exactly. It's about creating a more sustainable and just economic system.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those big, scary global challenges to the very personal question of what it means to live a meaningful life. And we've explored some truly mind-bending economic concepts that could, well, maybe change the world.
It's been a fascinating journey, and it's important to remember that these are all just ideas, and they're constantly evolving. There's no one right answer, no silver bullet solution.
True. But it's important to keep asking the questions, keep exploring the possibilities, and keep challenging the status quo. So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given all of this, given the potential of these new ideas, what kind of future do we want to create? And what role will money play in that future?
That's a good question.
Maybe we'll explore that further in our next deep dive. Until then, thanks for listening, and keep those sources coming.